where the crowns of Europe and beyond finally came to rest. These are the final resting places of 50 kings, queens, princes, and princesses whose gilded public lives concealed private tragedies of assassination, exile, madness, illness, and heartbreak. Queen Victoria, the longest reigning British monarch in history at the time of her death, and the sovereign who defined an entire age, died January 22, 1901, age 81. Buried at the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore in Windsor, beside her beloved husband, Prince Albert. Victoria spent 40 years in strict mourning after Albert's death in 1861 and famously wore black for the rest of her life. Her mausoleum, built to her exact specifications, is one of the most personal and heartbreaking royal graves in all of Europe. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, the eldest grandchild of Queen Victoria and heir presumptive to the British throne, died January 14, 1892, age 28, of influenza during a pandemic, entombed at the Albert Memorial Chapel in Windsor. Eddie's mysterious life and even more mysterious death have inspired centuries of speculation, including baseless theories that he was Jack the Ripper. His elaborate marble tomb is one of the most beautiful and tragic monuments at Windsor. Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, who suffered from epilepsy and possible autism, died January 18, 1919, age 13, of a seizure, buried at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Sandringham. John was hidden away from public view at Sandringham after his condition became severe, and his existence was largely erased from the official royal narrative during his short life. His small country grave is one of the most heartbreaking royal resting places in all of England. Prince Albert, the beloved consort of Queen Victoria, and the true intellectual force behind much of the Victorian Golden Age, died December 14, 1861, age 42, of typhoid fever, entombed at the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore. Albert's early death shattered Victoria, and she kept his rooms untouched exactly as he had left them for the rest of her life, laying out his clothes each morning as though he might return. His grave is the emotional heart of the entire Frogmore estate. King George V, the sailor king who steered Britain through the First World War, died January 20, 1936, age 70, hastened by a lethal injection, administered by his physician, to ensure his death would make the morning papers. Buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. The king had suffered for years from breathing difficulties, and his final hours became one of the most quietly scandalous chapters in the history of the House of Windsor. His grave holds a truth long hidden from the public. Queen Mary of Teck, the formidable consort of King George V and grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, died March 24, 1953, age 85. Buried at St. George's Chapel in Windsor beside her husband. Mary outlived her husband, her eldest son who abdicated, and her second son who became King George VI, absorbing loss after loss with the iron dignity that defined her. She died just weeks before the coronation of her granddaughter Elizabeth. King Edward V, later the Duke of Windsor, whose abdication for the woman he loved shook the British monarchy to its foundations, died May 28, 1972, age 77, of throat cancer, buried at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore in Windsor. Edward spent his post-abdication decades in luxurious but lonely exile, cut off from the family and country he had renounced. His grave at Frogmore honors a man whose romantic sacrifice masked decades of quiet regret. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, the American divorcee for whom a British king gave up his throne, died April 24, 1986, age 89, after nearly a decade of severe dementia. Buried at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore beside her husband. Wallis spent her final years bedridden, unable to speak or recognize her surroundings, in a Paris mansion controlled by a French lawyer. Her grave in the Windsor Burial Ground closes one of the most romantic and tragic royal love stories of the 20th century. King George VI, the reluctant monarch who overcame a debilitating stammer to lead Britain through the Second World War, died February 6, 1952, age 56, of coronary thrombosis after years of illness and heavy smoking, buried at the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor. The king's health had been catastrophically damaged by the pressures of the throne he never wanted, and he died in his sleep at Sandringham. His grave honors a monarch who quite literally worked himself to death for his country. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the beloved widow of King George VI, who lived to see her daughter reign for half a century, died March 30, 2002, age 101. buried at the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beside her husband. The Queen Mother survived the loss of her husband by 50 years and outlived her younger daughter Princess Margaret by just 7 weeks. Her death marked the closing of the last true chapter of wartime British royalty. Princess Margaret, the beautiful and troubled younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, died February 9, 2002, age 71, of a stroke following years of poor health. Cremated, with her ashes interred at the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beside her father. Margaret's forbidden love for Peter Townsend in the 1950s scarred her for the rest of her life, and her later years were marked by illness and quiet melancholy. Her ashes rest beside the father whose crown she never wore. Diana, Princess of Wales, the beloved people's princess whose glamour and humanitarian work made her the most photographed woman in the world, died August 31, 1997, age 36, in a car accident in Paris. Buried on an island in the middle of a lake at the Althorpe Estate in Northamptonshire, her ancestral family home. Diana's grave on the private Spencer family island is closed to the public, though a memorial temple beside the water welcomes visitors. Her death shocked the world and forever changed the modern monarchy. Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning British monarch in history and the constant public face of 7 decades of change, died September 8, 2022, age 96. Buried at the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, beside her husband Prince Philip. Her final years were marked by the deaths of her sister, mother, husband, and several beloved cousins, along with the traumatic public departures of her son Andrew and grandson Harry from official duties. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, the longest-serving royal consort in British history and the constant private support of Queen Elizabeth II, died April 9, 2021, age 99, buried at the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor beside his wife. Philip's own childhood had been marked by exile from Greece, family scandal, and his mother's confinement to a psychiatric facility, wounds that shaped his character for the rest of his long life. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of all the Russias and the final ruler of the 300-year Romanov dynasty, died July 17, 1918, age 50, executed by Bolshevik gunmen in the basement of the Ipatiev House in Yekaterinburg. Entombed at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg after his remains were finally identified and reinterred in 1998. Nicholas was murdered alongside his wife, 5 children, and their loyal servants, in one of the most infamous royal massacres in history. Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, the German-born wife of Tsar Nicholas II, whose devotion to her hemophiliac son Alexei drove her to embrace the mystic Rasputin, died July 17, 1918, age 46, murdered beside her husband in Yekaterinburg. Entombed at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Alexandra's isolation, illness, and desperate attempts to save her son helped destabilize the imperial regime in its final years. Her grave beside Nicholas closes one of history's saddest royal tragedies. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, the hemophiliac heir to the Russian throne whose illness was hidden from the Russian people, died July 17, 1918, age 13, murdered alongside his parents and sisters in Yekaterinburg. His remains were separated from those of his sisters and only rediscovered in 2007. Alexei's hidden suffering as a bleeder shaped his mother's every desperate decision. His grave stands as one of the most heartbreaking resting places in modern royal history. Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna, the youngest of Nicholas II's daughters whose reported survival spawned decades of imposter claims, died July 17, 1918, age 17, murdered alongside her family in Yekaterinburg. Her remains, long a mystery, were finally identified through DNA testing and interred at the Peter and Paul Cathedral. The Anna Anderson imposter case fooled the world for decades, adding a strange final chapter to a genuinely tragic young life. Grigory Rasputin, the mystic Russian holy man whose influence over Empress Alexandra fatally undermined the Romanov dynasty, died December 30, 1916, age 47, murdered by a group of Russian nobles who feared his hold on the imperial family. His body was reportedly buried, exhumed, and burned near Petrograd. Rasputin was said to have been poisoned, shot, and drowned before he finally died, one of the most sensational assassinations of the 20th century. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, the beautiful and free-spirited Bavarian princess known as Sisi, who spent decades escaping the stifling Habsburg court, died September 10, 1898, age 60, stabbed with a sharpened file by an Italian anarchist in Geneva. Entombed at the imperial crypt in Vienna, Sisi's grave in the Habsburg vault holds the memory of a woman whose radiant public image concealed decades of depression, eating disorders, and grief. Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the only son and heir of Emperor Franz Joseph, died January 30, 1889, age 30, in a murder-suicide pact with his teenage mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera, at Merling Hunting Lodge. Entombed at the imperial crypt in Vienna, the Merling incident remains one of the most notorious royal scandals in European history, and Rudolf's grave in the Habsburg crypt holds the memory of a brilliant but tortured young man. Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary, the last great emperor of the Habsburg dynasty who reigned for 68 years, died November 21, 1916, age 86, entombed at the imperial crypt in Vienna. Franz Joseph outlived his brother, his son Rudolf, his wife Sisi, and his nephew and heir, Franz Ferdinand, absorbing loss after loss with the same imperial stoicism that had defined his reign. His grave is the emotional heart of the vanished Habsburg Empire. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne whose assassination triggered the First World War, died June 28, 1914, age 50, shot alongside his wife Sophie in Sarajevo, buried at Artstetten Castle in Austria. Because Franz Ferdinand had married for love beneath his station, he was denied burial in the imperial crypt with his ancestors, a final indignity for the man whose death changed the entire course of human history. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king whose lavish castles including Neuschwanstein bankrupted his kingdom, died June 13, 1886, age 40, drowned in Lake Starnberg under circumstances that remain deeply disputed, buried at St. Michael's Church in Munich. Declared insane and deposed just days before his death, Ludwig may have been murdered or may have taken his own life. His grave in Munich holds one of the most romantic and mysterious tragedies in the entire history of European royalty. King Umberto I of Italy, the second king of the newly unified Italy who survived multiple assassination attempts before finally being killed, died July 29, 1900, age 55, shot by an anarchist in Monza. Entombed at the Pantheon in Rome. Umberto had reportedly told his aides that he was resigned to being killed and refused increased security. His grave in the ancient Pantheon holds a monarch who lived for years in the shadow of his own inevitable murder. King Alexander I of Yugoslavia, the strong-willed monarch who unified the South Slav kingdoms under his personal rule, died October 9, 1934, age 45, shot by a Bulgarian assassin during a state visit to Marseille, France. Buried at the Church of St. George at Oplenac in Serbia, Alexander's assassination was one of the first political killings ever captured on film, and the shocking footage played in newsreels around the world. His grave at Oplenac is the heart of the Serbian royal mausoleum. Queen Astrid of the Belgians, the beloved young Swedish-born queen whose warmth and humanitarian work had endeared her to the Belgian people, died August 29, 1935, aged 29, in a car accident in Karlsnacht, Switzerland, while her husband, King Leopold III, was driving. Buried at the Church of Our Lady of Laeken in Brussels. Astrid left 3 young children behind, including the future kings Baudouin and Albert II. Her grave in the royal crypt honors a queen whose loss plunged Belgium into national mourning. King Farouk I of Egypt, the final ruling king of Egypt who was overthrown by military coup in 1952, died March 18, 1965, age 45, of a heart attack while dining at an Italian restaurant in Rome after consuming a massive meal. Buried at the Al-Rifai Mosque in Cairo after his remains were finally allowed to return to Egypt. Farouk's shocking obesity and rumors of foul play surrounding his sudden death remain part of the mystique of his exiled final years. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran who was forced from his throne by the 1979 Islamic Revolution, died July 27, 1980, age 60, of complications from lymphoma in Cairo. Entombed at the Al-Rifai Mosque in Cairo. The Shah spent his final months seeking refuge from country to country as no nation would accept him, and he died in exile just 18 months after fleeing Tehran. His grave in Cairo honors one of the most consequential exiles of the 20th century. King Alexander I of Greece, the young king who took the Greek throne when his father was forced into exile, died October 25, 1920, aged 27, of septicemia following a bite from his pet monkey at the royal estate at Totoi. Buried at the royal cemetery at Totoi Palace outside Athens. Alexander's bizarre death from a monkey bite was one of the strangest royal fatalities in modern history, and Winston Churchill later remarked that 250,000 people died as a result of that monkey's bite due to the political turmoil that followed. King Constantine II of Greece, the last king of the Hellenes who lost his throne after the 1974 referendum, abolished the Greek monarchy, died January 10, 2023, age 82, of a stroke in Athens. Buried at the royal cemetery at Totoi Palace outside Athens. Constantine spent decades in exile in London before finally returning to his beloved Greece in his later years. His grave at the family estate honors a monarch who lived to see his crown abolished, but not his personal dignity. King Louis XVI of France, the ill-fated Bourbon monarch whose reign ended on the scaffold of the French Revolution, died January 21, 1793, age 38. Executed by guillotine in the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Entombed at the Basilica of Saint-Denis outside Paris after his remains were located and reinterred during the Bourbon Restoration. Louis was a well-meaning but weak king caught in a revolutionary tide that swept away centuries of French monarchical tradition. His grave at Saint-Denis is a somber pilgrimage site. Marie Antoinette, the Austrian-born Queen of France whose extravagance and foreignness made her a hated symbol of the Ancien Regime, died October 16, 1793, age 37, executed by guillotine in Paris 9 months after her husband, King Louis XVI. Entombed at the Basilica of Saint-Denis beside her husband, Marie Antoinette spent her final months in a squalid prison cell, separated from her surviving children, and endured a mock trial before her execution. Her grave closes one of the most tragic royal stories in all of European history. Napoleon II, the King of Rome and only legitimate son of Napoleon Bonaparte, died July 22, 1832, age 21, of tuberculosis in Vienna, as a virtual prisoner at the Habsburg court of his grandfather. Entombed at Les Invalides in Paris beside his father, after his remains were repatriated by Adolf Hitler in 1940 as a diplomatic gesture. The boy who might have been Napoleon III lived his short life as a pawn of European powers. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French whose military genius reshaped Europe before ending his life as a prisoner on a remote Atlantic island, died May 5, 1821, age 51, on the island of St. Helena, entombed at Les Invalides in Paris beneath a massive porphyry sarcophagus after his remains were repatriated in 1840. Napoleon's final years in exile were marked by illness, boredom, and bitter reflection. His tomb in Paris is one of the most visited royal graves in the world. Empress Josephine, the Creole beauty who became the first wife of Napoleon Bonaparte before being cast aside for a Habsburg princess who could give him an heir, died May 29, 1814, age 50, of pneumonia at her beloved Château de Malmaison. Buried at the Church of Saint Pierre and Saint Paul in Rueil Malmaison, Josephine died just weeks after Napoleon's first abdication, heartbroken by his exile and the loss of her imperial position. Her grave outside Paris honors a woman whose love story with Napoleon has fascinated the world. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry V, whose failure to produce a male heir sealed her fate, died May 19, 1536, age approximately 35, beheaded by a French swordsman at the Tower of London. Buried at the Chapel of St. Peter, ad Vincula, within the Tower of London walls. Anne had reshaped English religious history through her marriage to Henry, only to die 3 years later on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason. Her grave beneath the Tower Chapel is one of the most tragic resting places in British history. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of King Henry V, whose youthful indiscretions before and during her marriage cost her life, died February 13, 1542, age approximately 19, beheaded at the Tower of London. Buried at the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, beside her cousin Anne Boleyn. Catherine had been a teenager when she married the aging Henry, and her execution for adultery followed months of terror and interrogation. Her grave beside Anne is one of the most heartbreaking corners of the tower. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen who was placed on the English throne by ambitious relatives against her own will, died February 12, 1554, age 16 or 17, beheaded at the Tower of London, on the orders of her cousin Queen Mary I. Buried at the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. Jane was a devoutly Protestant teenager whose brief unwanted reign ended in the axe. Her grave in the small chapel beside Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard is one of the most poignant royal resting places in England. Mary, Queen of Scots, the tragic Catholic queen whose life became a 19-year saga of imprisonment and intrigue, died February 8, 1587, age 44, beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle on the orders of her cousin Queen Elizabeth I. Reinterred at Westminster Abbey by her son King James I, Mary had spent nearly 2 decades as a prisoner of Elizabeth after fleeing Scotland, and her execution required 3 blows of the axe. Her grand marble tomb at Westminster is one of the Abbey's most visited sites. Empress Myeongsong of Korea, the last empress of Korea whose modernizing influence made her a target of Japanese imperial ambitions, died October 8, 1895, age 43, assassinated by Japanese agents at the Gyeongbok Palace in Seoul. Buried at Hongneung in Namyangju, South Korea. Queen Min's brutal murder and the subsequent burning of her body by her assassins was one of the most shocking royal killings of the entire 19th century. Her grave outside Seoul honors a queen whose death became a rallying symbol of Korean resistance. King Zog I of Albania, the self-proclaimed king who fled his throne during the Italian invasion of 1939 and never returned, died April 9, 1961, age 65, in exile in Suresnes, France. Originally buried in Thaïs Cemetery in Paris, his remains were later returned to Albania and interred in the Royal Mausoleum in Tirana in 2012. Zog was said to have survived more than 50 assassination attempts during his reign, a testament to the violence of Balkan royal politics. Queen Caroline of Brunswick, the mistreated wife of King George IV, who was famously locked out of her own husband's coronation, died August 7, 1821, age 53, of an intestinal obstruction just weeks after the coronation humiliation. Buried at Brunswick Cathedral in Germany, Caroline had endured years of separation and public trials in which her husband tried to divorce her by Act of Parliament. Her grave in her German homeland closes one of the most miserable royal marriages in British history. Prince Rainier III of Monaco, the sovereign prince whose fairy tale marriage to Grace Kelly captured the world's imagination, died April 6, 2005, age 81, of complications from heart, kidney, and lung problems. Buried at St. Nicholas Cathedral in Monacoville beside his beloved wife Grace, who had died in a car accident 23 years before him. Rainier had reportedly never fully recovered from Grace's death and lived out his final decades in quiet grief. Their shared tomb is one of the most romantic in Europe. Princess Alice of Battenberg, the mother of Prince Philip and grandmother of King Charles III, died December 5, 1969, age 84, at Buckingham Palace, where she had lived in her final years. Originally buried at Windsor and later moved to the convent of St. Mary Magdalene in Gethsemane, Jerusalem, at her own long-standing request. Alice had spent years confined to a psychiatric facility for schizophrenia and had also risked her life during World War II by hiding a Jewish family from the Nazis. Her grave in the Holy Land honors one of the most quietly heroic royal figures of the 20th century.